Australia has enormous cities separated by enormous distances. Moving between these major centers can consume hours of a daily routine. Flying solves part of the geography, but creates its own door-to-door friction. The alternative is high-speed rail. Imagine the cities of Newcastle and Sydney separated by roughly 1 hour rather than feeling like distant, disconnected commuting markets. But there is a massive contradiction at the heart of this vision. Australia has been debating versions of this exact idea for decades. Yet the country still does not have a single operating high-speed railway. Look at the eastern edge of the Australian continent. The fundamental geographic logic of the country is built around massive populations concentrated in a handful of coastal and near-coastal centers. You have Brisbane in the north. Then you move down the coast to Newcastle, Sydney, Canberra, and finally Melbourne in the south. The physical distance between these cities dictates exactly how the national economy functions. Right now, moving between them requires relying on heavily congested airspace or spending hours navigating highways and conventional rail networks. A drive between Sydney and Newcastle means sitting on the motorway, completely vulnerable to traffic bottlenecks, holiday congestion, and weather delays. The existing passenger trains share legacy alignments with heavy freight and suburban services, making the journey slow, winding, and prone to interruption. Distance creates friction. It dictates where you can realistically live, where you can work, and how much of your day is surrendered simply to transit. High-speed rail should initially feel almost like an obvious answer to this friction. The travel demand clearly exists. The train technology itself has been operating safely and efficiently in other parts of the world for decades. When you look at the map, the equation seems incredibly simple. If the logic is that clear, you have to ask why the railway is not already in the ground. The answer to that question requires looking closer at what is actually being proposed, because the railway currently moving through formal development is much more ambitious than simply making existing journeys a little bit faster. To understand what is at stake, you have to look at the scale of the intended infrastructure. This is not about putting a slightly faster train on a 100-year-old track. The project requires building an entirely new, dedicated high-speed alignment. The proposed trains are designed to travel at speeds up to approximately 320 kilometers per hour. At that speed, the map of Australia begins to compress. A journey from Newcastle to Sydney is projected to take roughly 1 hour. The Central Coast would sit approximately 30 minutes away from either major city, and this is only intended as the opening phase of a much larger East Coast vision. The long-term ambition stretches from Melbourne in the south, up through Canberra and Sydney, all the way to Brisbane. High-speed rail does not physically make the Australian continent smaller, but it makes distance matter significantly less. It allows you to imagine the eastern seaboard functioning as an integrated economic corridor rather than a series of isolated metropolitan islands. You could step onto a train in the center of one city and step out in another without navigating airport security or highway traffic. But out of all the possible starting points, the government had to choose where to lay the very first tracks. They could have started by connecting Melbourne to its regional centers. They could have focused on the national capital in Canberra. They could have emphasized the booming population around Brisbane. But the first project currently in the formal development phase targets the corridor between Sydney and Newcastle. At first glance, Newcastle might seem like an unusual place to begin a national high-speed rail network. Melbourne has a larger population and is a massive economic engine. Canberra is the political center of the country. Brisbane is a major metropolitan center experiencing rapid demographic growth. So why prioritize the route heading north out of Sydney? It is a question that reveals the true nature of the entire mega project. If you only evaluate this railway based on transport engineering or moving the absolute maximum number of intercity business travelers, the priority sequence might look different. You might start by linking the two biggest capitals. But the decision to develop the Newcastle to Sydney corridor first is a massive clue. It indicates that the High-Speed Rail Authority is not just trying to solve a traffic problem on the motorway. They are trying to solve a structural problem. Newcastle is an important regional city. but it has historically functioned as a distinct economy from Sydney. The geography between them features difficult terrain and sprawling suburbs, making the current commute grueling. By targeting this specific friction point first, the planners are signaling a different set of priorities. The reason Australia may want to start here has surprisingly little to do with the train itself. The real project is housing. This is the mechanism that changes everything. If Newcastle suddenly becomes approximately 1 hour away from the center of Sydney by high-speed rail, the psychological and economic geography of the region fractures and resets. A city that was previously considered too far for a daily commute suddenly falls within an acceptable travel window. The Central Coast experiences an even more dramatic shift. If residents there can reach central Sydney in roughly 30 minutes, the area essentially becomes a highly connected suburban ring. This completely alters where housing capacity can be placed. For decades, the economic gravity of Sydney has forced workers to compete for expensive real estate within a limited radius of the central business district. People tolerate high housing costs because they need access to employment. High-speed rail offers a way to stretch that commuter radius by hundreds of kilometers. The business case argues that this infrastructure can unlock entirely new housing markets along the corridor. It means a family could realistically buy a home in a regional center while maintaining access to the wages and career opportunities of a global financial hub. It shifts the pressure away from the immediate Sydney basin and distributes it along the rail line. Regional economies would no longer be isolated outposts relying solely on local industry. They would become deeply integrated partners in a larger metropolitan network, sharing workers, resources, and growth. Imagine the life of a young professional or a growing family currently priced out of the Sydney market. Right now, their choices are either taking on crippling mortgage debt for a small urban apartment or moving to a regional town and accepting a lower-paying local job. High-speed rail creates a third option. It bridges the gap between regional housing affordability and metropolitan earning power. When a train can move you at over 300 kilometers per hour, the map of opportunity is redrawn. The railway is not merely attempting to move Australians faster. It could fundamentally change where Australians can realistically live and work. You can start to see how transformative this becomes. It is not just about a sleek train rolling into a station. It is about Newcastle, the Central Coast, and Sydney operating as a single, cohesive economic zone. The government estimates that improved connectivity will drive productivity, create jobs, and revitalize regional hubs. And if that model proves successful on the first corridor, it creates the blueprint for the rest of the East Coast vision. You replicate that regional integration down toward Melbourne. You replicate it up toward Brisbane. You connect cities like Canberra, creating a web of economic hubs that operate together. The idea is incredibly powerful. It feels completely rational. The geography demands it, the housing market desperately needs it, and the technology can absolutely deliver it. The audience can look at this plan and actively want it to succeed. Everything sounds almost too logical. And that is exactly where Australia's high-speed rail story becomes uncomfortable. Because laying down visionary lines on a map is entirely different from carving physical infrastructure into the earth. It is easy to get swept up in the renders and the projections of a seamlessly connected future. But this grand vision relies on successfully executing the very first step. The first section of the dream may also be one of the hardest sections to deliver. Let us talk about engineering. When you look at the map, the line between Newcastle and Sydney looks incredibly straightforward. It is only about 160 kilometers, depending on the exact route. But laying track capable of sustaining 320 kilometers per hour in a straight line is very different from building that exact infrastructure through the real Australian landscape. The route designed to prove high-speed rail can work in this country must begin by surviving an extremely difficult delivery challenge. A conventional train can follow the existing winding valleys, curve around hills, and slow down through suburban corridors. A high-speed train cannot. To maintain velocity, the alignment has to be relatively straight and relatively flat. That means confronting difficult terrain head-on. It means carving through solid sandstone, navigating complex geological faults, and bridging major environmental waterways. The Hawkesbury River sits right in the middle of the corridor. To get past it at high speed, you need massive structural solutions, whether that means soaring viaducts or deep underwater crossings. And as the train approaches Sydney, the surface is almost completely built out. The only way to reach a central terminus without destroying thousands of existing homes is to go down. That means major tunneling requirements through one of the most densely populated and expensive real estate markets in the entire country. The geology deep underground is often uncertain. The construction complexity is immense. Every kilometer of tunnel adds significant financial weight to the project. Every complex bridge structure introduces new engineering risks. The line that looks so simple on a presentation slide must survive the brutal reality of civil construction. And the more difficult the railway becomes to physically build, the harder it becomes to confidently predict how long it will take and how much it will eventually cost. This brings us to the second major threat. The real test for Australia is not whether they can engineer the railway. With enough money, enough concrete, and enough boring machines, modern engineering can solve almost any geological problem. The deeper question is whether the country can deliver it at a cost and on terms that taxpayers continue to believe are worth paying for. Technical success alone is not enough. A railway could be technically possible and still become politically difficult if its value proposition loses credibility. This is why the current development phase is so critical. The High-Speed Rail Authority is not just drawing lines on a map. They are trying to nail down constructability, scope, and most importantly, cost certainty. Infrastructure Australia has specifically identified the need for further work on funding strategies and housing outcomes. Because if the estimated price tag suddenly balloons before a single shovel hits the dirt, the political equation changes. The dream of a 30-minute commute from the Central Coast sounds fantastic, until the public decides the infrastructure bill is simply too high. The government has to prove that the economic value unlocked by new housing and regional integration actually outweighs the massive capital required to carve the tunnels and lay the track. If the costs spiral out of control during the design phase, the project becomes vulnerable. It ceases to be a transformative housing solution and starts looking like an enormous financial burden. Money matters because it ultimately affects whether the dream continues. The business case has to remain robust enough to survive public scrutiny, because a railway that costs too much to justify will never leave the planning documents. That financial pressure elevates the stakes for the entire mega project. Newcastle to Sydney is not just another regional railway connection. It is the opening stage of a much larger high-speed rail ambition that stretches all the way to Melbourne and Brisbane. Therefore, the first line potentially has to demonstrate much more than simply running on time. It has to demonstrate useful travel times that actually change commuter behavior. It has to prove credible passenger demand. It has to show that the projected housing benefits are real and that regional integration actually works in practice, not just in an economic model. Most importantly, it has to establish delivery credibility. The first line is not simply part of the network. It is the argument for the network. If the first stage struggles to establish value, if the costs lose credibility, or if the delivery timelines stretch into decades, convincing governments and the public to advance the much larger future stages could become exceptionally hard. The entire East Coast vision rests on Newcastle and Sydney succeeding. And the reason that is such a heavy burden for this specific route to carry is because Australia has faced this exact question before, many times. This brings us to the ghost that haunts Australian infrastructure. You do not need to memorize a list of transport reports to understand the history of this mega project. You only need to recognize the pattern. Since the 1980s, the country has experienced a cycle of high-speed rail proposals. There was the Very Fast Train project, decades ago. There was the Speedrail proposal. There have been numerous East Coast scoping studies and high-profile government announcements spanning multiple political eras. A plan appears. A new map is drawn with sleek lines connecting the major capitals. Optimism grows around the economic benefits and the faster travel times. Extensive feasibility studies are commissioned, published, and debated. Then the estimated costs become public. The political environment shifts, the economic conditions change, and the railway never materializes. Different decade, different government, different route proposal, but always the exact same missing thing. The train. Australia has repeatedly failed to turn the high-speed rail idea into an operating high-speed railway. Whenever a new proposal is announced, a significant portion of the public instinctively assumes it will eventually be cancelled or delayed indefinitely. It is completely rational and built on decades of empirical evidence. So that leaves a massive question hanging over the current corridor between Newcastle and Sydney. If the history of failure is this consistent, what makes this current attempt any different? The story rhythm has been established over 40 years of proposing, studying, delaying, and abandoning. Breaking that rhythm requires more than just a better train. It requires a fundamental shift in how the project is managed and funded. So what makes this attempt different? The short answer is that this attempt actually is different. This is not just another theoretical line drawn on a map by a think tank. There is now a dedicated high-speed rail authority established by legislation. They have clearly identified the first line. The project is actively moving through a formal development phase, backed by initial government funding. There is real engineering, design, and project development work happening right now. The explicit goal of this phase is to move the project toward genuine construction readiness. They are working to nail down the environmental approvals, the exact alignment, and the final business case. For the first time in a long time, the preparation feels intended to actually build something. You can look at this institutional momentum and think that maybe this time, Australia is actually going to do it. Having an authority and a budget for planning is a massive step forward. It proves the government is serious about exploring the reality of the line. But you have to take part of that comfort away with one simple, undeniable distinction. Development is not construction. That factual distinction opens up the final and most dangerous threat to the dream. The ultimate enemy of Australian high-speed rail is not the geology of the Hawkesbury River. It is not the complex tunneling required beneath Sydney. The biggest enemy may simply be time. Mega projects of this scale do not happen in a single political term. They unfold across many years, sometimes decades. To get from a business case to an operating railway, this project has to survive a brutal timeline. It has to survive the final funding decisions when the true capital costs are fully revealed. It has to survive the awarding of massive civil contracts. It has to navigate inevitable construction delays, shifting supply chains, and changing economic conditions. And most importantly, it has to survive changing political environments. A project that takes a decade to build will almost certainly see multiple changes in state and federal governments. Each transition carries the risk of reassessment, reprioritization, or outright cancellation. This returns us directly to the historical failure pattern. The engineering problem is building physical infrastructure capable of lasting for generations. The institutional problem is maintaining enough continuous commitment to get it built in the first place. The question is not whether the trains will mechanically fail. The question is whether the project can remain intact through enough decisions, enough governments, and enough years to finally become physical infrastructure. Australia is an enormous country. Its major cities are far apart, and the friction of distance dictates how the national economy functions. High-speed rail could fundamentally change that travel. More importantly, it could change regional growth, housing capacity, and how Australians think about commuting. But for decades, the story has primarily been about what Australia could build in theory. This current attempt will eventually be judged by something much simpler. It will be judged by whether the railway actually gets built. If Newcastle and Sydney eventually become approximately 1 hour apart, Australia will not merely have built a faster train. It will have broken a pattern of failure that has survived longer than any previous Australian high-speed rail proposal. The geography demands it. The housing market needs it. The development work is well underway. It is a race against time, cost, and political endurance. The only question left is whether Australia will finally do it. This video is for educational and analytical purposes, relying on public project proposals, business case projections, and historical records. Future alignments, costs, and timelines are subject to change. This content does not constitute financial, real estate, or professional planning advice. Do you think the Newcastle to Sydney line will finally break the historical pattern and become a reality? Let me know your perspective on Australia's high-speed rail future in the comments below. Subscribe for more deep dives into the mega projects shaping our world.